My name is Bob Hayes. I was born in Vermont in a little town called Salisbury and lived there only for maybe a year. Then I moved to Pittsford, and Pittsford is a small town too, and that's where I grew up and went to high school, and then eventually left and went in the Army and to college. But that was my home for quite a while, and I lived on a little farm. My dad and mother raised chickens, and my dad was a carpenter. My dad was also a soldier in World War One, and my grandfather was also in the Civil War. So I sort of had a military background there. And an interesting thing about my grandfather was he was in the Union Army in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. And when I met Georgia, of course, she told me she was from Virginia, and her folks lived in the Shenandoah Valley. And we got to talking back and forth and kind of telling stories. And we thought probably our grandfathers met there on different sides and were shooting at each other, and they made an agreement to miss because they knew their descendants were depending on them. So that's the little story I have. And my grandmother, who was my grandfather's wife, of course, she lived with us until I was 10 years old. And she told me quite a few stories about the Civil War and about my grandfather. And unfortunately, I never wrote them down and didn't remember them. And I wish there'd been something like this back in those days to record the stories that she told me.
What's your general impressions of the stories that you remember, though? Do you have any general impression?
My grandfather enlisted at the start of the war, and his regiment went to Virginia, and we're in several battles there. And then it came fall, and he decided he wasn't going to stick around because the Union Army in the wintertime just sat, sat around in tents, and there was a lot of sickness. He decided he was going to go home and court my grandmother. So he did, and he stayed all winter, and I guess they had a good time. And then it came spring, and he went back and joined up with the army again, and that was kind of the common custom then to come home in the wintertime, even though you weren't supposed to.
Oh, right.
And my grandfather had three brothers in the Civil War. One of them was named Joel, and he enlisted when he was 15 years old, and he was captured by the rebels and died in a prison camp.
Yeah.
So when I talk to this boy here with the name Joel, I brought back memories of my grandfather. Okay.
What's your earliest memory of growing up in Vermont? You said you were about 4 years old.
Well, I have this story, and I claim to be the last person that's a survivor of an Indian arrow wound. And there's quite a bit of fact associated with it because when I lived in Vermont and I don't know, I suppose I was 4 or 5 years old, uh, up the road from us, there was an Abenaki Indian family that lived there. And they had a little boy that was about my name. And we played together. And of course, we made bows and arrows out of willow branches. And we, for the arrows, we put a nail in the end of the arrow and cut the head off and then filed it so it was sharp. And then we would shoot it into the side of the barn and into trees and try to shoot birds. And one day we were playing this game called I gotcha, you know. I pulled my bow back with an arrow on it and pointed at him, and he'd say, I got you, and all of a sudden his fingers slipped. The arrow flew right into my chin, stuck in my chin. I ran into the house screaming for my mother, and my mother looked at me and said, oh my God, you've been shot. And she reached up and jerked that arrow out, and then a whole bunch of blood came out. So that's how I claim to be the last survivor of an Indian arrow wound.
That's a great story. I love it. Do you remember the boy's name?
No, I don't.
Okay. How about when you were a teenager? You went on some kind of a canoe trip. Tell me about that story.
Okay, I have a good friend. His name is Ray, and he was in the same school I was in. He was about 2 grades behind me, and we used to go out in the woods and camp and hike around. And one time we decided we would like to take a canoe trip. So we thought, we looked at the map and we figured out a route and thought, well, we could put the canoe in right here, right outside of town, and we could go clear to Hudson Bay, about 500 miles. So we went around and we bought a second-hand canoe, and we paid $25 for it. And of course, it wasn't in very good condition. And so we practiced around town there for a while. And then about, I don't know, the first part of July, we loaded all of our gear in the canoe and got ready to go. And I remember Ray's mother said to Ray, now, Ray, you be careful, and I want you back here in time to go to school in the fall. And Ray was probably 14 or 15 years old, and I can't imagine a mother saying that or letting her boy go off on a trip like that now. But anyhow, we put the canoe in the creek just down from our house and went down the creek and into another creek and then into Lake Champlain. And we paddled the length of Lake Champlain and then went down the Richelieu River to the St. Lawrence. And we got down to the St. Lawrence and we started along the shore of the St. Lawrence and we had to cross it. And where we crossed it, the St. Lawrence forms a big lake there called Lake St. Pierre. And it's about, I think it's 20 or 30 miles across the lake there. And our canoe, it had a lot of leaks in it, and one of us would paddle and the other one would bail. So we started across the lake there, couldn't see the other side, but we had a compass. So we were paddling across the lake there, and of course the canoe was half full of water and didn't have much freeboard in it. And we noticed this was just at the start of World War II. So we noticed this Canadian destroyer coming down the lake, and it slowed up real slow and then nosed in behind us. And the guy out on the deck hollered at you, do you need assistance? And we said, no. And he said, well, our lookouts reported you as a German submarine and asked us to attack with depth charges. So they said, we'll follow you to the shore. So they followed us clear across the lake to the other side, and then they sped on down the river to their convoy. And we got to the other side there. It's a little town, Three Rivers. And there was a canoe club there. And we went in there and asked them about how to get to Hudson Bay. And they were astounded that we'd even got that far. And so they told us how to get there, and we started up the St. Maurice River, and we hit some rapids. So we got out and was pushing our canoe up through the rapids there, and Ray had all of the money in his pocket of his shirt, and I think we had about $10 or $15. and he was pushing it up the rapids there, and his wallet fell out into the river. We never noticed it until that night, and there we were, 300 miles from home with no money. So we decided we would have to quit. So we went over to the railroad station and put our canoe on there and sent it back to the United States. And then we started hitchhiking from Canada, and all we had to eat was a big sack of dried prunes. It took us about 4 days. We'd eat those dried prunes and drink some water, and of course that filled us up. So that's the story of our canoe trip. We never did make it to Hudson Bay.
How long were you gone?
We were gone about 2 weeks.
All right. That's an exciting one. Well, what you had some lookout stories. I guess you had. What got you started cooking? You said your lookouts.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it was after I got out of the service, and Ray was still in the service, and it was during the last stages of World War II, and they drafted Ray to be a lookout because they were worried about Japanese fire balloons. The Japanese were sending these balloons over, and they would hit the United States, and then they would drop these fire bombs. And the idea was to set the woods on fire. So the Forest Service got real antsy about that, and they were during the war, and it was hard to get a lookout, so they got Ray. Ray was about 15 or 16, and he went on the lookout and was there for 6 or 8 months or so. And then I got discharged, and Ray was telling me about this wonderful job he had, so I thought, oh, sounds pretty good. So I applied, and I got the job as lookout. And Ray was a lookout on another mountain about 20 miles away. And we used to talk back and forth on the telephone. And that's probably where I started doing most of my cooking because, of course, you're up there by yourself and you have to do your own cooking or starve to death. But anyhow, we did that for 2 years, and the last year we were on lookout, we made up our mind that after the lookout season was over, we were going to go to the University of Vermont and enroll in forestry. But during that summer, there was a party of girls that came up to Ray's lookout and were talking to him, and one of the girls mentioned that she was going to the University of Vermont in the fall too. So Ray, of course, got her name, and when we came down from the lookout and went to the university, and we were sitting in this class, and this girl walked by, and Ray nudged me and says, "That's her." And it turned out he introduced me to this girl, and it turned out to be my wife. We got married about 2 years later, and then came to Montana.
Oh, that's great. Going back to your war, what was the first? You were on a submarine, right? So tell me about you being on the submarine going to Italy.
Well, first I lied about my age and enlisted when I was 16 in 1942, and I was in the Army for I don't know a month or 2 months, and they found out what my age was and kicked me out. So I waited for another year, and then I enlisted again, and I was 17 then, and took my training, and then they sent us down to Newport News, Norfolk, Virginia, where they were forming a convoy of ships to go to Italy. And we were there for a week or so, and then we finally ordered the troop transport. And I remember we were standing on the deck there, and all of a sudden some guy said, "Look, the dock is moving." And when you're on a ship like that and it starts to slowly back away from the dock, it does look like the ship is standing still and the dock is moving. But anyhow, we went down Chesapeake Bay and out into the ocean, and of course, everybody immediately got seasick, and there were about 3,000 fellas leaning over the rail there. I didn't get seasick, but I didn't eat any meals for 3 days. But we started out across the ocean there, and I don't know how many ships were in the convoy, but uh, we were the biggest ship in the convoy, and I think the only troop ship. And there were several destroyers and destroyer escorts going around convoy to protect us from submarines. Of course, we didn't have any thought of being close to the war. We thought, well, we're going to Italy, and that's probably 5,000 miles away. It'll be weeks before we get there. We were just a bunch of kids having a good time, and one day, late in the afternoon, over the loudspeaker, we heard, now hear this, now hear this. All Navy personnel, man your battle stations, man your battle station. Army personnel, go below to your quarters immediately. So we filed down about 3 decks below sea level, and they said, get in your bunk there and make sure you got your life preserver on and your rifle, have your rifle there. And so we did that, and there was one little blue light overhead, and all of a sudden the ship made a big sharp turn, and there was a bunch of explosions, and then it kept doing that, making all of these zigzag maneuvers, and there was these explosions, and there was one big explosion, and the light went out. So we were in total darkness there, and with all of this noise up overhead, and we didn't know what was going on, and the officers were coming around with flashlights and saying, now if we give the order, you're to file up on deck quietly and go to your abandoned ship station. And so we didn't say anything. We just laid in our bunk, and one guy said, God, oh God, protect me. Please don't let me die here. And it was pretty eerie, and some guy said, shut up. And the guy immediately was quiet, which was a big relief because we were getting pretty uneasy. Anyhow, that all went on for about an hour or 2 hours, and then finally things quieted down, and they let us up on deck, and we got up there and looked around, and everything looked pretty normal. And we asked the sailors what happened, and they wouldn't say a word. They would just get up and walk away, and the officers wouldn't tell us a word either. And we didn't know if it was really a submarine attack or if it was just a drill. And it wasn't until a few years ago that I got a book out of the library that described all of the convoys that went across the Atlantic. And there was a description of our convoy, and it seemed like the submarines attacked it right outside of Gibraltar, and they sunk 2 ships. And of course, they were after our ship because it was the biggest ship in the convoy, and it had 4,000 troops on it. So that was my first experience in World War II.
Did you ever see any warfare in Italy or not?
Yeah, when I got to Italy, I volunteered for the 10th Mountain Division, and they sent us to the mountain training school, and we learned how to rock climb and pack mules. And then they decided they needed more mule packers, so they formed a pack company there and gave us 200 mules, and all of our non-coms and officers were from the 10th Mountain Division, and they sent us up to the front there, and we packed supplies up to the front lines till the war was over. And then after the war was over, they took our mules away from us and gave them to the Italian farmers, and I guess they sent some to Greece, and then they put us on a ship, and we were supposed to go to the invasion of Kyushu. And we got down into the Mediterranean, I don't know, a day's journey or so from the Panama Canal, and the Japanese surrendered. So we just made a right angle turn and went into Boston Harbor. We were about the first ship that came in there after the war was over, and we got off in the ship and lined up there on the wharf there, and we were going to march down to the railroad station, and they give us the command, right shoulder arms, left face, forward, hot. And when we did, the crowd just broke through the lines there, and they mobbed us. And there was, I swear, there was two girls hanging around my neck, and there was people putting candy in my pockets and bottles of whiskey, and they followed us clear down to the train for. Then we got on the train there, and they followed us a little ways on the train, but of course the train took off, and they couldn't. So it was quite an experience.
Sounds like it. So you went to University of Vermont then after, were you the lookout? Then you went to University of Vermont?
Yeah, that was a lookout for 2 years, and then I went to University of Vermont, and let's see, I started there in 1948, and I went there for 2 years, and they just had a pre-forestry program there. You had to transfer after 2 years, so I transferred. I came out here to Montana because Ann's uncle worked for the Forest Service here, so we came out here. I'd been married about a year. We came out here, and I went to the university and studied forestry, and then I went to work for a logging company and worked on a logging crew for until about 2000, I guess. We had some interesting experiences there. One time I was out in the woods there talking with a foreman of a logging crew, and I had a map there, and we were leaning over the hood of his pickup, and I was showing him on the map there where he was supposed to cut timber. And all of the time we were talking there, I could hear this chainsaw running in the background, and all of a sudden I heard a crack, and my foreman there, Norm, says, "Look out!" And we looked up, and there was a tree coming right for us. And I jumped on one side of the truck, he jumped on the other, and the top of the tree fell down and hit the truck right where we were standing.
You didn't get hit that day.
Then another time I was out in the woods then, and I was checking on the sawyers. And the sawyers are the one that cut the trees down. I could hear this chainsaw going okay, and I was kind of creeping up on the guy because I didn't know exactly where he was. And then all of a sudden I looked up, and here comes this tree right towards me. So I took off through the brush, and it missed me all right.
Was there one time that you were nailing something and you...
Oh, yeah, one time I was cruising timber, and it was in the wintertime, snow on the ground, and kind of steep ground. And when you measure a tree, you have a tape that goes around it and has a little hook on the end, sort of like a big, heavy fish hook. And what you do is you put the hook in the tree and then walk around the tree and measure it. Well, I walked around the tree and had the tape up there, and I decided I had to pull it up on the tree a little bit more, and I was kind of standing on my tiptoes, and I had the hook in one hand and the tape in the other, and I was kind of pulling it up there and getting it there, and all of a sudden my feet slipped out from under me, and the hook went into my thumb, and I was hanging there on the hook by my thumb, and I couldn't get my feet under me. It took me about a minute or so to get my feet under me, and when I finally did, I reached up there and pulled the hook out. It bled pretty bad, and I took my handkerchief out and wrapped it around my hand and went to work for the rest of the day. I had a big scar on my thumb there, but it's pretty well disappeared now.
And you had some hypothermia or hyponatremia?
Yeah, one time I was out cruising timber, and hadn't got very far out in the woods there, and I didn't have my heavy coat or anything on. It started to rain. It was in the wintertime, and it was kind of a warm rain, and then it quit raining and got really cold. And uh, I was kind of wet and cold, but I kept on working. And when you measure a tree, you have an instrument and you shoot. You take a shot at the butt of the tree, and that gives you one figure. And then you take a shot at the top of the tree, and you have another figure, and you have to add them together. Well, I was going along, and I'd shoot at this one tree and say, well, I got 14 and 60. That's 70, 74, 76 feet. And then I'd shoot at another one and say, well, I got 16 and 80. And then I'd say 16 and 80. 16 and 80. And it took me a while to add them up. And pretty soon I was going, I got 21 and 70. And I was kind of slurring my words. And all of a sudden I realized I was getting hypothermia from being so cold. So I quit right there, and I went over and I found a pitchy stump and set that on fire and huddled around that until I got dried out and ate my lunch, and then I was okay.
How about the hyponatremia?
Well, the hyponatremia is where you drink too much water and it washes the potassium and sodium and salts out of your body. And Tom and I were doing this long race. It's 62 miles, and it was really hot. It was up in the high 90s. And before we started out on the race, they told all the runners, now drink just as much water as you can. This was in about, I don't know, 1996 or 97 there. And so we started out on this race, and we each had 2 water bottles. And every time we'd come to a creek, we'd fill the water bottles and we'd pour one on our head and drink the other one. And we did that for the whole race, which took about, I don't know, 10 or 12 hours. And Tom was ahead of me, of course, and so he got to the finish line before I did. And my wife was there watching us come in, and she said just before Tom got to the finish line, he fell right on his face, and he had trouble getting up. And Tom swears that my wife, his mother, came over and kicked him and told him to get up, but I don't know if that's true or not. But anyhow, he was there at the finish line when I came in about half an hour later, and I noticed he was kind of acting funny. He was kind of walking around, and then he started to run in place, and he asked somebody, "Where's the finish line? Where's the finish line? I want to finish the race." And they went over and got the doctor in the first aid tent, and he came over and he said, "Take him right to the hospital." Well, he had hyponatremia from drinking too much water, and they put him in the hospital there and gave him IVs, and he was there for about 7 or 8 hours. And when I came in, I wasn't quite that bad, but I went over to the motel there, and immediately I was sick to my stomach. And my friend Rich came over and rapped on the door, and he said, "Are you okay, Bob?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess so. I gotta throw up, Rich. Wait a minute." Well, he's heard that, so he went right over to the first aid tent and got them to come over and get me out of the motel, and they wanted me to go to the hospital, but I didn't go, but I thought I was okay. And I said, well, I'll go down and see my son Tom and see if they think I ought to have any IVs. But I got down there and I was okay, but he had to spend about 7 or 8 hours in the hospital there from hyponatremia. So we learned after that you don't drink all of the water that you possibly can. You have to be careful.
Well, speaking of running, what motivated you to start running? Tell me about that.
Well, all of my kids ran before I did, and I was working out in the woods, of course, and I said, "Oh, I got plenty of exercise. I don't need to run." And so we've got a community center up there at Evero, and we decided to put on a 5 and 10K race to raise money. So all of the directors said, well, we don't know how many runners are going to come. Maybe all of us directors will have to run. So the kids were eager for me to do that. So I started running, and I did a 5K, and of course I got hooked and been running ever since. I think that was about 1987 that I started running. I've been running ever since then. Just can't seem to quit. I got this one person there that keeps motivating me. And
what was your first marathon? Tell me about your first marathon.
I think the first marathon I did was the Coeur d'Alene Marathon. And that was about 7 or 8 years after I started running. And then the next year I did the marathon in Helena. And then a couple of years went by, I didn't do a marathon, but I kept seeing this fellow's name in the paper. He was from Columbia Falls. His name was Mark Carr. And every year they'd have a story about Mark Carr won the Elkhorn 100K. And he did it in, I don't know, 8 or 9 hours. Mark Carr wins the Elkhorn 100K for the 5th time in a row. And I thought, I wonder if I could do that. And so I decided, well, heck, I guess I'll just sign up for it, and then I'll have to do it. So I signed up for it, and Ann was up at the lake, and at our place on the lake, and she came down one day, and I said, I signed up to do 100K. She said, what? How far is that? And I said, 62 miles. You are completely out of your mind, and I'm not going to go over there and watch them carry you off the hill in a stretcher. But of course, she couldn't resist, and she came over, and I did the 100K, and I survived okay, and I did about 6 or 7 more of those. And Tom retired from the Army and came out, and that's when we did that one where we both got hypothermia.
Mm. So what has been one of your favorite races to do?
The last one I did. I don't know. I like that John Coulter that you and I did that time pretty well. And I like the Mount Sentinel Hill climb. The Mount Sentinel Hill climb is really a different type race because you start out and you're going full bore just as hard as you can clear to the top. And it's a pretty good climb, as you know.
Yeah. Changing gears a bit, you're interested in a lot of different artistic endeavors like carving and calligraphy and wood carving. What got you interested in those artistic things?
Well, my dad was a sort of an artist. He didn't work on it very much, but he was a really good. He could sketch a picture, and he made little carvings around the place there and worked on it. And I don't know. I always was interested in that and drawing. And then one time I was talking to my neighbor, and she was telling me about this class in calligraphy that she took, and so I thought, gee, maybe I'd like to do that. So I enrolled in the calligraphy class, and I really liked it. It's fancy writing, and I took about 8 or 10 classes in calligraphy. I'd take one every year, and they'd have different alphabets, and you'd have to make a little project after when you were in the class to have a kind of a final exam. So I got interested in doing that, and then uh, when I was working in the woods there for a while, I was scaling down at the mill, and you sit around there and wait until the log truck comes in, then you measure the logs on it, and so I had some time on my hands there, and I started to do a little wood carving there, but I've never really done an awful lot of wood carving. But I like to draw, and I like to do calligraphy.
Yeah, you did a nice job. What is your favorite time of year and why? Or do you have one?
I don't think I really have a favorite time. Of course, I like spring because everything is greening up. And it's pretty out. There's lots going on. But I don't know if I have a really favorite time of the year. I think I like the whole year. I
Cool.
get I get to run just about any time. In the wintertime, I ski. And summertime, I'm really busy. Go up to the lake once in a while. Have a sailboat. And it's funny, Ray and I, after I left the University of Vermont, Ray went to the University of New York in Syracuse, and he bought a sailboat then, and I bought one when I came out to Vermont, and Ray eventually bought a larger sailboat, and 32-footer, and he was living in Portsmouth. I went back there one time and went sailing with him, and then later on, he was written up in the book The Perfect Storm. He was going south to Florida where he was going to spend the winter, and he had two girls with him to help him sail the boat, and they got caught in a perfect storm. And the Coast Guard and the girls panicked and called the Coast Guard and wanted to be picked up because they were really scared. But Ray had been in storms before, and he knew the boat was safe. And the Coast Guard came out with a ship and finally made them all leave. And Ray had to abandon his sailboat, and eventually it came up onto the shore in New Jersey and it was perfectly unharmed.
Hmm.
And I never knew about this until I was reading the book The Perfect Storm, and I talked to Ray on the phone about once a month. He never said a single thing about it, and all of a sudden here's a chapter in The Perfect Storm about Ray Leonard and his sailboat.
So you know famous people. You're famous yourself. Any other stories you would like to share?
Ah. Well, my wife passed away in 2007. She had Alzheimer's. And of course, it was quite a shock to me, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And so I just kind of was out of it for a couple of years, and then I went over on New Year's Eve. About 2 years later, or 3 years later, I went over to the university first night, and I walked up into the university center, and I walked by the ballroom there, and I looked in, and I saw some people dancing, and it sort of looked like square dancing. And when I was a boy in Vermont, we used to have square dances in the town hall about twice a month, so I knew about square dancing. So I looked in there, and I thought, saw those people squaring. I thought, maybe I'll go in there and see what they're doing. So I walked in there, and I just got in the door, and I met a girl that I'd taken a calligraphy class from, and Pat Cross, and she said, "Come on and dance with me." And I said, "Well, what are they doing?" She said, "This is the Contra Dance." So I went out on the floor with her, and geez, I just had a great time, and I really enjoyed it. And so she said, now they're having one down in Missoula, and over the Union Club in about 2 weeks. Why don't you come? So I did, and of course I got hooked, and that's where I met this kind of hippie girl that wanted to run with
Yeah, it was supposed to be one race.
me.
4 years later. Yeah. Well, so contra dancing, you're hooked on contra dancing and running at this point.
Hmm?
You like to contra dance. You don't miss a dance. You don't miss a race.
Mhm.
You average what 35, 40 races a year now.
Yeah, try to. I try to do one every weekend, and some weekends I do two or three. they have a race over at Great Falls called the Icebreaker. They have a 5 mile, a 3 mile, and a 1 mile, and you can do all three of those on one day if you want to. And then here in Missoula, they have the bank run, which is a 10K, a 5K, and a 1 mile. And you can do all three of those. And I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, I did the bank run here on Saturday. I did 3 races there, and then I went over to Great Falls on Sunday and did 3 over there. So I got 6 races that week. But usually the icebreaker is at a different date than the bank run. So this year I did the same thing, but the icebreaker I think was a week or 2 weeks later.
So you had a little reprieve. Yeah.
So I only got 3 on each weekend.
And you've done the polar bear run on New Year's Day a couple of years.
The polar bear run is just a 5K race up at Thompson Falls. And after you finish, everybody goes down to the Clark Fork River and jumps in the river. They call it polar plunge. And
No, thank you.
I go down there and put my bathing suit on, and you have to walk out on the dock. And before I walk out on the dock, I say, I'm going to walk out on the dock and I'm going to jump in. I'm not going to pause and think about it, because if I stopped, I wouldn't do it. So you walk out to the end of the dock and jump into the water and climb on an ice floe and come right out. It's not as bad as it sounds.
Sure.
The hard part is making up your mind to walk out to the end of the dock and jump in.
I think your wife was crazy when she said you were crazy. That was right. Yes.
Okay. All right, now, besides being the last survivor of an Indian arrow wound, I'm also an ordained minister.
Oh, that's right.
And the reason I decided to be a minister is my Tom was talking about getting married and was thinking about who he would have to marry him. And I looked in the paper or a magazine or someplace, and I saw you could send into some place in California and make a $5 payment, and they would send you a certificate that said you were an ordained minister. So I did that. Took it down to the courthouse and had it recorded. And then I married each one of my kids. I think Tom I married twice, and I'm not sure about Andy. And I had my license hanging on my office in the building there where the logging crew hung out, and they got to looking at it, and so they used to call me the Reverend.
The Reverend Runner.
Yeah. And then, of course, the word got around, and I think I've performed about 20 or 25 weddings, different people. I performed one up on top of Snow Bowl, where the people were on skis, and several up at the lake. So.
That's nice. Yeah. Cool.
Okay, let's see what else I have here. When I was about, I don't know how old it was, maybe 1 or 2, my mother said I had whooping cough, and I was really, really sick, but I survived that, and I've always been really healthy since then. I boast that I've never spent a single night in the hospital, and I don't know how I do it, because I've never consciously tried to be healthy, but I guess eating my own cooking and running has done it. That's about the story of my life.
Okay.
Where are your kids now?
My oldest boy lives in Bozeman, and he and his wife teach there at the university. They teach math, and they're both runners, like to run, and they like to ski. And then my other boy, Andy, lives next to me up at Evero, and he's a retired smoke jumper. He was a smoke jumper for 30 years, I guess, and had all kinds of adventures. And my daughter lives up in Ovando with her husband, and she likes horses, and she does these long distance rides on horseback, 150 miles in one day. And she and Ann started out doing those together, and then Ann got injured so many times she finally quit riding. But my daughter's never been injured riding, so and she still does these races every year.
She's taken a horse to Europe, right?
Yeah, she went over to the Iran, I think, Iran, over there in the Middle East. She went over there one time on a race, and then she went to Spain one time, and I think she went to Germany too with her horse over there. And then she's done. They have a race in California they call the Western States, and you can do it on foot, or you can do it on horseback. And she's done that several times. I think one time she took third place in there. And I don't know. I don't think Tom has ever done that as a foot race, but he's done. I don't know. I think he said 16 or 1800 milers. He and his wife together. And he one time he wanted me to do a 100 miler. So he gave me an entry for the Wasatch Face 100 miler for a birthday present. I wasn't too enthused about it, but I went down and I got to 40 miles, and it was getting dark, and there was no place to pull out after that stop. And Ann was there, and she was kind of antsy and wanted me to quit, so I went back to the motel and quit. And Tom continued on and got to the 75-mile mark, and he wanted to pull out too. And they said, well, there's no one going out until morning, so why don't you just take a cot there and uh, sleep until morning. So he slept for 4 or 5 hours, and then he got up and he thought, well, I don't feel too bad, so I think maybe I'll just keep on running. So he did, and he finished okay. And I hadn't been running too long. I hadn't been running long distance races, and I didn't realize what a difference it makes there when you get discouraged and tired and you want to quit. If you just stop right there, just lay right down on the ground and sleep for a couple hours, and you get up and it changes your whole attitude.
Well, you've done the 50-mile La Gris several times.
I've done that, I think, 16 or 18 times.
And the last one, well, what do you do to motivate yourself to run that?
I guess just the challenge of doing it.
Okay.
And I found out to do those long races, you don't want to, when you get up in the morning, you don't want to think about running 50 miles. You don't want to think, oh God, I got to run 50 miles. You just think, I'm going to run to the first aid station, which is maybe 7 or 8 miles down the road. And I say to myself, I'm going to run to the first aid station. If I don't like it, I'm going to quit. So I get to the first aid station. I don't feel too bad. So well, I'll go to the next one. So you just keep doing it in stages like that. And eventually you get down there where you're only 10 or 20 miles from the finish, and you think, man, I'm not going to quit now. So you just keep on going. And that's the way you do those long races. And people have run, I think some people have run 150 miles doing it that way. And it's sort of like any big problem in life, if you look at the whole problem, it's overpowering. But if you think, I'm just going in and start out and see how it goes, like you can, the saying in running is that your body will take you far, far longer than what you think it can. And it's your mind that makes you stop. It's not your physical capacity. I think George has found that out too.
Ah, indeed. Well, anything else? Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Nice.
It was interesting.